For 1956, Aston's had no new weapon. The DBR1 was still on the drawing board, and the DB3S was pressed into service again, albeit with some smoothing out of the bodywork. Gone were the razor-edge tops of the wing lines, and the air intake became more aerodynamic. Headlamp fairings were also added to smooth the airflow. An elderly car then, but to counteract this, and following Mercedes' withdrawal from the sports car racing scene, Aston's now had the services of Sterling Moss, the man who could be relied on to get more than the best from an uncompetitive car.
Aston's, I think, built one of the most super handling trucks, really, by comparison. I mean, an Aston was a well-built but beautifully handling car. From the DB3S and the DBR1 and so on were really nice, apart from the gearbox. The gearboxes in the Astons were dreadful, and quite a lot of the drivers would get, you know, raw hands. And then we did manage to talk them into trying a Mazda gearbox and putting it into an Aston, which made a great improvement. But they really were a great car because you could take an Aston, you could throw it around. It's rather like, it's a sports equivalent of a Cooper racing car. You could really throw around and sort of semi-abuse it. Well, you can with an Aston. And Astons were nice people. Had John Wire, who was a terrific team manager, a very dry sort of guy, you know. And John Wire always used to, wherever we went, you'd always know that there was a jolly good restaurant nearby, which I think was very good. I still reckon one of the finest restaurants in the world is Lochmüller near Nürburgring, but it isn't near. You see, it was about 35 kilometers away, but that's okay, boys, that's where we're going. And Chartres and so on from Le Mans. And so John had his priorities right. You know, if you've got a happy team and they're well fed and everything, then the cars will go well. And I think overall, they did a good job, and the cars were extremely good, and I think that very enjoyable to drive for them.
Well, you know, I did buy, I think, 2 or 3 Astons, and I used to race them privately. And when the works were short of cars, if any were shunted, I used to loan my car back to the works. And it so happened I was driving this particular car at Silverstone, and I had made fastest time in practice. And Sterling wanted to try the car, and he had the right to try all the team cars. He was #1 driver. But what he didn't know was that it was actually my car, and John Wire told him this and said, well, if you want to go and borrow the car, go and ask Roy. Well, really, he never did. But if he had, I would have loaned him my car. We all admired Sterling. We regarded him as the top driver in those days, certainly the top driver in our team. All he had to do really was to ask me, not John Wire.
2 cars had been shunted in May at Silverstone, so Roy's own DB3S, #5, was pressed into service again at the Nürburgring for Peter Collins and Tony Brooks. Roy himself shared DB3S 8 with Peter Walker. Collins had now joined the Ferrari Grand Prix team and had moved to live in Modena. With Grand Prix now dominating his life, his sports car driving was suffering, and his best lap time was 10 minutes 43 compared to Brooks's 10 minutes 27. And this was Tony's first visit to the German circuit, as well as Aston's. Wire had reported very bad handling over what today would be regarded as poor services for rallying, never mind World Championship racing. And Wire blamed the increase in unsprung weight following the adoption of disc brakes on also a lack of speed. Brooks and Collins finally finished 5th, 1 lap behind the winners. Brooks' debut performance at the ring was most impressive, and although it wasn't on the cards that he and Collins could have done much better, if Peter had driven as well as Tony, who knows? Still suffering from the broken ribs and heavily bandaged after the crash at Silverstone, Salvadori drove well. He and Walker were in 4th place when the De Dion tube broke, putting Roy in the ditch and out of the race and back into hospital. Also likely to end up in the ditch is this Porsche with Erlid aerodynamic wing. The race was won by Maserati, with 4 drivers being credited with it. Taruffi and Shell, whose car it actually was, plus Moss and Behrer, who took it over after Moss had crashed earlier. Fangio and Castellotti finished 3rd, and Mike Hawthorne crashed the D-Type while in 4th place. After that disastrous accident at Le Mans in 1955, the rules were changed yet again in 1956, and the race was for prototypes up to 2.5 litres, and only the so-called production cars, of which 50 had been built, could race with larger engines. Jaguar and Aston were both successful in proving that 50 D-types and DB3Ss had been built, or at least they'd made provision to build 50. The 2.5 litre prototype class marked the debut of the DBR1. This was Aston's first ground-up racing design, and there were no concessions to the production components. Everything was designed and built for this project. It had a state-of-the-art space-frame chassis, a 2.5-litre version of the new all-alloy RB6 engine, giving about 215 brake horsepower, and the engine had twin-plug cylinder head and dry-sump lubrication. There was, however, to be an Achilles heel.
Just that the gearbox was untried, and they went away from their normal type of gearbox to this rare axle gearbox combined. That was quite new, and we hadn't given it enough testing. There's an explanation for that. We did try and do some testing at Monza, for instance, for 24 hours, but then we were snowbound, and we tried somewhere else. We didn't have a crack of the whip with that gearbox. We took it as it was, virtually untried.
To encourage an equal weight distribution, the car had been designed to use a rear-mounted gearbox, and this was combined with the differential. David Brown's built the CG 537 transaxle, and it was to prove a constant source of trouble to the team. The new car was driven in the race by Reg Parnell, taking part in his last Le Mans 24-hour race and partnered by Tony Brooks. The so-called production DB3Ss were in the hands of Moss and Collins and Salvadorian Walker. The Jaguar team were decimated by an early crash. Paul Frere spun at the S's, eliminating Fairman's D-type, and Portago's Works Ferrari was also involved. Hawthorne's sole surviving Works D-type suffered a cracked fuel pipe and was relegated to the back of the field. This left the Ecuria Cost Jaguar and Ninian Sanderson and Ron Flockhart out in the lead, chased by Moss and Collins in their DB3S. The other DB3S had gone out earlier when Walker crashed under the Dunlop Bridge, while the new DBR1 proved uncompetitive with its highly stressed engine. Running on a weakened mixture to comply with the new refueling regulations, it ran its bearings after some 20